So just a little bit about our speaker before we start. So Jovina James is a general practitioner working in Queensland and is a mother of 4 children. She was raised in Sydney, educated at USYD, where she also found her faith and became a World Youth Day enthusiast. Now she follows her husband's work around Southeast Queensland, rendering her an expert house mover and book club founder. She has a special interest in palliative care and communication in medicine. Her great dream is to swim between all the Croatian islands, but for now she's very happy splashing with her kids in her backyard pool. All right, the floor is yours, Jovi.
Oh, well, I am so grateful for this opportunity to be with you all this evening. Thank you for having me. Mainly because I wanted to, I love spending time with other people in virtual settings, but also because it gets me we're an hour behind in Queensland. So you're right now getting me out of dinner, bath, bedtime routine with my kids, which is a bit of mayhem. So I'm leaving my husband to do that alone. I'm most grateful to you for giving me that chance. I'm also grateful that you're letting a USYD alumni into this because I realize that's a big deal. So thank you. Now, we all love a good COVID factoid. So, any old anecdote about some strange consequence of COVID that has come up that we never really anticipated, whether it's dolphins swimming in the canals of Venice or Disney screening Hamilton for free, Disney Plus screening Hamilton for free unexpectedly. There's all these great little things that have come about because of COVID this year. But I'm going to be a bit of a party pooper, I'm sorry, and start with quite a shocking and sad factoid. And that is, did you know that in the first half of this year, there was in Victoria, where physician-assisted suicide is legal, there was a sharp increase in the number of requests for physician-assisted suicide. And doctors who are administering this think that it's because terminally ill patients are worried that COVID will deny them the death that they'd anticipated. So they're getting in early with their applications for assisted suicide. In the words of one euthanasia doctor, he said, "It gives a sense of control for when circumstances become absolutely unacceptable." It gives a sense of control for when circumstances become absolutely unacceptable. Now, I'm going to jump from quite a existential factoid to recall your minds to the toilet paper fiasco of early 2020. We all knew we were all on some sort of spectrum of this, whether we were on the haves or the have-nots, but why did this even happen in the first place? And on one level, I would say it's because people could not bear the thought of running out of toilet paper. So they turned into greedy, hoarding, nasty competitors in some sort of hygiene Hunger Games. It's funny though, because also for this little factoid, you could actually use the same quote from that euthanasia doctor where he said, "It gives people a sense of control for when circumstances become absolutely unacceptable." These two stories, or these two COVID moments, seem so distant from each other, but I hope that they show all of us that we actually live in a world that uses comfort, whether it be the comfort of toilet paper or the comfort of being able to plan our own death, as a guiding appetite for almost everything we do. And so I'm going to start with a quote from Archbishop Charles Chaput. He said last year in a talk, "A culture committed to and organised around the pursuit of things that make a life comfortable can never really value nobility, honour, courage, or magnanimity, the qualities that distinguish us as human. Because these very different things demand self-denial and risk and a belief in something or someone greater than ourselves. Comfort lived as a guiding appetite produces mediocrity." It's at this point that I'd now like to jump somewhere completely different, and I'd ask you to think about Disney's possibly most hated on protagonist, and that is Simba, and his years in the wilderness. I really hope that I'm not destroying any... I hope everyone who's seen The Lion King or at least knows what happens, because otherwise I'm just about to entirely plot spoil the whole thing, and if you are, block your ears for about 20 seconds. So after Mufasa dies, when Simba believes that he has caused his father's death, what does he do? He runs away. And soon, distracted by the oasis of Timon and Pumbaa's lifestyle, he forgets his guilt and his responsibility, and he settles into a life of Hakuna Matata. There is no time here for honour or duty or taking responsibility. These three just want to find their next slimy yet satisfying meal. It's the problem-free philosophy, and it seems entirely innocuous, doesn't it? Why wouldn't you want to live this way? What's wrong with living this way? But remember that Simba living this way causes neglect and harm to the pride back home. So he loses his sense of identity, and therefore his mission, and therefore his purpose. And if it weren't for that Rafiki knocking profound wisdom into his head, he may have continued in his comfortable lifestyle forever. So I'm going to ask you tonight on this Friday night when you probably had a better offer, but you're here. So I'm going to ask you now, what do we lose? Sorry, not everyone had a better offer. I know you're in quarantine, one of you. So what do we lose when our life is about avoiding suffering at all costs? How much effort do you go to remain comfortable? What gives you a sense of control? And what kind of suffering would be absolutely unacceptable to you, do you think? Let's face it, we live in a world where a poor Wi-Fi signal can lead to utter despair, and any sort of imposition on public transport can spark outrage. But this is a warped, polluted, and unhuman mode of existence, and we have to shake it off regularly if we're to live a life awake, a life to the full in Christ. So from Disney now, I'm going to jump to a guy called Benedict XVI, who you may have heard of. And he wrote in a really good encyclical called Spe Salvi. He wrote, "It is when we attempt to avoid suffering by withdrawing from anything that might involve hurt, when we try to spare ourselves the effort and pain of pursuing truth, love, and goodness, that we drift into a life of emptiness, in which there may be almost no pain, but the dark sensation of meaninglessness and abandonment is all greater. It is not by sidestepping or fleeing from suffering that we're healed, but rather by our capacity for accepting it, maturing through it, and finding meaning through union with Christ, who suffered with infinite love." So what he's teaching us here is about redemptive suffering. Kind of a strange phrase, and maybe something that might be a little bit foreign to you. When we suffer and we offer it back to the Father, we are acting just like another Christ. The Father wills us to participate in his redemptive plan, and he offers us a way. So I'll just go back to that quote, because Benedict XVI says, when we accept it, mature through it, and we find meaning through union with Christ. This is probably the much more superior and spiritual version of the growth mentality that we hear so much about now. But it's the same kind of idea of accepting suffering, maturing through it, and finding meaning through union with Christ. We are going to jump now to my good friend here, Viktor Frankl. Oh gosh, so disoriented. Viktor Frankl and his wife. Viktor was an Austrian psychiatrist and neurologist who was imprisoned in 3 concentration camps during the Nazi Holocaust. Afterwards, he wrote a remarkable book called Man's Search for Meaning. Some of you might have read it, in which he noted that although all the prisoners in his concentration camps were in the same hellish circumstances, they didn't all react the same way. Some walked themselves into electric fences to escape. Others clung to life and found joy despite the atrocities occurring around them daily. Frankl makes sense of this by observing that man can endure anything if he has a reason to live, and can endure nothing if he doesn't. He wrote, "If there is a meaning in life at all, then there must be a meaning in suffering." He went so far as to write, "Suffering is an ineradicable part of life, even as fate and death. Without suffering and death, human life cannot be complete." This is so countercultural, isn't it? It's the idea that suffering is part of life and can actually make life complete. This is not what we see on our TV screens, on our iPads. This is nothing of our culture right now. We're in a culture that wants to avoid any sort of suffering as completely unacceptable. And some of you might be thinking that I'm speaking about some distant hypotheticals. You know, this idea of suffering is not so immediate to you. But some of you, I know, have already known tragedy in your lives. And most of you will. And anyone who has read the Gospels knows that the apostles did not have a life free of suffering and tragedy. Far from it. So if we can see what we're leaving behind, how do we even begin to gently alter our lives from Hakuna Matata to redemptive suffering? It doesn't happen all in one. We start small, perhaps with the practice of offering it up. That means offering up the minor daily hardships that continually strike us like irritating jabs, thereby giving those little offerings a meaning. Maybe you have a crick in your neck from too many Zoom sessions, or maybe you're in quarantine for another week, or perhaps your anxiety is playing up and you're not sleeping so well. What does it mean to offer something up? Those people who do this habitually and with proper understanding of redemptive suffering believe that they can insert these little annoyances into Christ's great compassion, so that they somehow become part of the treasury of compassion so greatly needed by the human race. So in this way, even the smallest inconveniences of daily life can actually acquire meaning and contribute to the economy of good and of human love. It's not a new idea, but I must say it's revolutionary in our time and so much needed. Now, I wasn't raised with this at all. This was all very new to me at some point in my life. I've always been a kind of comfort girl, you know. I like my creature comforts. But 11 years ago, after World Youth Day 2008, I found myself walking the Camino in Spain. I'm sure most of you have heard of it, but if you haven't, you can ask about it later. I could actually talk for hours about the Camino, just ask my poor husband, but that's not the point. I laugh when I talk about this, but my preparation for this 30-day walking pilgrimage, was to choose my 2 best pairs of undies that were going to stand the distance, and also to learn how to reliably drain blisters overnight with a sewing needle and thread, because blisters is the thing that most pilgrims seem to dread going on the Camino. It's the big, you know, pilgrimage killer, really. I thought this was going to be the worst part. I had no idea. There were blisters, there was sweat rash, there was tendinitis, there was all sorts of physical little things. Even in the fittest of walkers, walking a pilgrimage like this inevitably brings physical hardships that you have to endure. And a lot of people didn't make it. And I don't mean it like they failed. They didn't complete the physical journey, but who knows what was going on in their hearts, right? Anyway, for me, it was a huge awakening. My ankle hurts, but I can't just stop walking for a day or two, because you can't. You only stay in a refuge for a night and you move on. So for once in my life, I actually had to endure pain and see how and live it out. And slowly, because it was so silent and there was no one to talk to about it, I started to offer it to God as a prayer. So in the end, one of my blisters became a prayer for my sister. My sore ankle, was for my best friend. And then slowly through these feeble offerings, I was slowly being taught what it meant to unite sufferings, no matter how small, to Christ on Calvary. And it really wasn't just a physical experience in the end. I slowly learned to offer my own woundedness, my own insecurities, and God was showing me something I had never experienced before. Afterwards, I kind of thought, oh, this is so you can become a more empathetic person and be a better doctor, because at that stage I was halfway through med school. But I didn't know how much tragedy was actually going to strike my own life. Oh, I missed giving you the photo of the blister. That's okay, I won't give you that. But I will tell you that 8 years after the Camino, there's my boys, my now husband Gabriel and I welcomed our second child, that's him, Theodore, into the world. And I'd be lying if I told you that I wasn't freaked out by the thought of having 2 children so close together. But when I saw our older son, Maximilian, how much he adored him, I could see that with only 17 months between them, they would be the best of friends. And I thought, I can see God's plan here. But when Theodore was 8 months and 3 days old and the strongest, fattest baby you've ever seen, he went to heaven in his sleep. And travelling to the hospital with him and watching the resus effort in ED and holding his lifeless body and leaving the hospital without him were obviously the worst moments of my life. And every day after then, for a long time, waking up was horrible, because it meant it wasn't a horrible dream anymore. But one of my only real strong memories of that time, because it's all kind of a blur, is the day after he died. My husband and I found ourselves at Mass, and it was just like a weatherboard, typical Queensland kind of beachside church with a, a really unceremonious kind of mass. It was just a daily mass, and I was kind of like a zombie. I don't think I brushed my hair. It was just, you can imagine. But I remember just kneeling that time and saying, I have nothing, God. I have nothing. You are it. And I just said that over and over again because I didn't know what else to say. It didn't really make much sense. But it's the closest, the fullest I've been to spiritual poverty, realizing how little I really had and how much I needed to rely on God for absolutely every moment. And that was a regular kind of, for days, weeks, I don't know, it was a regular kind of conversation between me and God. Just those little phrases, it was all I had. But slowly I saw that we were being carried by the prayer efforts of so many family and friends around us, and it was keeping us afloat. That's what it felt like. Just that kind of like this raft floating and tossed around, and who knew where we were going to end up. But I gradually began to see that my vision of the importance of heaven had become so much clearer. That my mission, that my role in life to get my husband to heaven isn't just mere words anymore. It wasn't some nice platitude we said on our wedding day. It's real, it's my job. And that for my son Maximilian, and now Theodore's two younger siblings who've come along since then, that heaven is something we talk about every day. It's real to them in a way that I can't imagine talking about with children otherwise. The importance of staying close to Jesus and understanding that we're called, Teddy's not called to be back here with us, that we are called to be where Teddy is and that he prays for us. And these have been such important lessons to live with my children. Above all, I feel the presence of God. In those days particularly, I felt the presence of God more closer than I ever had in my entire life. There was nothing quite like it. And I know it wasn't God's will that Teddy died, but God has transformed the suffering that I still bear from his loss. My pain is not just pain. It can be transformed and redeemed, and it has been transformed and redeemed every time I offer it back to God, and can be used for the good of the kingdom. In a very different example of my own life, our youngest child, Louis, was born 18 months ago, and he has a very cheeky personality. He has a mean one eyebrow raise, and he can spot a plane in the sky before it even takes off, I'm sure. And he was also born with a congenital myopathy, which means that he has a muscle disorder making his muscles very weak. And already thousands of hours of therapy have gone into helping him use his fingers, his hands, and helping him learn to sit. We really don't know what lies ahead for Louis. We don't know if he'll walk. And I cannot tell you what it is to fear for his future. And for my own, if I'm being honest, I think the days he was born, I just thought I was never going to have any freedom ever again. And I don't know, there's a whole lot of emotions, but yeah, there's a lot of fear there. And I think the mystery of the trials that he'll face in life is still unfolding before me. And my acceptance of it, I realise, is not his acceptance. That is something that he will have to do in his own life. And I hope he will. And I pray that that will be something that he can do every day. But I know that none of his trials are useless. And all of them can be used for God's redemptive work and for his glory, if we can learn to keep offering them to him. I'm going to stop talking about my life now, and I'd like to offer you one final aspect on the meaning of suffering. And this one is, it's really beautiful, actually. On the 9th of August this year, it was the 75th anniversary of the bombing of Nagasaki. So when the United States dropped a nuclear bomb on a relatively moderately sized Japanese city called Nagasaki, which is also the most Catholic city in Japan. So instantly, it's estimated that around 40,000 civilians were killed straight away. Many of them completely incinerated. Their bodies were not really found. At least 60,000 were injured and many more died in the following days. The carnage and horror, I mean, I'm sure you all know about the horrible consequences of that bomb in Japan. And the carnage, and also, sorry, in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And the carnage and the horror is beyond human telling, really. Then there was also the ongoing radiation sickness in the survivors. which was horrendous and documented very well. And it was arguably the worst of man's inhumanity to man, played out on a world stage, but not really revealed at the time. I think it slowly got revealed in the decades that followed. In the midst of all that was Takashi Nagai, who was a radiologist, a pioneer of the technology of X-ray in Nagasaki. So he's one of the first radiologists that existed in that area. So Nagai was a convert to Catholicism from Shinto, and he had already developed leukemia before the bomb because of his constant exposure to X-rays in his work. He knew suffering on many, many levels. He lost his wife the day of that bomb. He suffered many injuries himself on the day of the bomb, and he also experienced ongoing radiation sickness for the rest of his life. So this man knew a lot of suffering. And yet the years he lived after the war, although mostly immobile and filled with physical pain for him, he wrote profusely and without bitterness of that experience of living through the bomb. And he wrote about the experience of his children and his fellow countrymen in Nagasaki. And he wrote about it with tremendous faith in God and the purpose that God was giving to all the suffering of those around him. The kind of things he wrote were just, I mean, worth reading themselves, because he was such a wise and holy man, and he became revered as a wise and holy man by people of all faiths around Japan and all around the world, actually. He was visited in this little small hut where he'd never left because he couldn't move anymore, by everyone from Helen Keller to our own Cardinal Gilroy. And through his physical struggles, he became convinced that suffering, greatly accepted, refines the human heart, and the experience of darkness shapens the vision of the spirit. And I'll just offer you a little quote from him that I think is just most profound when you think what he's been through. And he said, "Unless you have suffered and wept, you don't really understand what compassion is, nor can you give comfort to someone who is suffering. If you haven't cried, you can't dry another's eyes. Unless you've walked in darkness, you can't help wanderers find the way. Unless you've looked into the eyes of menacing death and felt its hot breath, you can't help another rise from the dead and taste anew the joy of being alive." So that's Takashi Nagai with his children. So having talked a lot about suffering on this Friday night, sorry for being a bit of a downer, if we know now, and if we know that avoidance of suffering is not the thing that should be guiding all our decisions and all our measures, then what is? What else is there in the Christian life? If it's, and I just want to make clear that we're not all, as Catholics, we're not all about going out and grabbing all the suffering we can and stuffing it into our lives. That is also not the thing. We're not like this kind of, we're not sadists. And I think we always have to remember that Christ didn't just carry his cross around a meaningless journey. It was a journey up to Calvary, and there was a journey beyond that. So just in case it sounds like I'm being like, yes, get all the pebbles and put them in your shoes and walk around, I'm not saying we need to go out and invite the suffering, but just to be clear, we are a joyful people, but the avoidance of suffering at all costs is such a dangerous way that our culture is living right now. So if we're putting all that, if that is not the way that we want to live, then how about we focus on mission instead? Now, mission strictly, I mean, if you go back to the etymology, it really means to be sent. And I'm sure you notice that no one in the Bible is ever given an experience of meeting with our Lord without then being sent. Now, unless you're a spy, no one ever explicitly tells you what your mission is week by week or day by day. But we do know that our general mission is clear, and that is to be saints in such intimate communion with God that we may wholeheartedly devote ourselves to the glory of God and the service of our neighbour. And there is such a mission we have. Sometimes it sounds like a very big kind of job to be saints. So sometimes it's helpful to break it down a little bit further. Benedict XVI, again, sorry, a little bit of a favourite, at World Youth Day in Sydney, he said, "Let unifying love be your measure, let abiding love be your challenge, and let self-giving love be your mission." So what would that look like in your life? Are you living unifying, abiding, and self-giving love? What does it look like in any life, really? Sometimes these are just words, but what does it look like? I mean, if only the church would give us a whole bunch of people who had lived lives of heroic virtue before us to give us an example, right? If only there were souls in heaven that had known the day-to-day struggles that we experience in this earthly life, who could be our friends and then pray for us. But we do have that, don't we? We have the saints. Now, again, I didn't grow up with an idea. Well, no, I did know about the saints growing up, but all I knew of as a child was I'd been taught that saints were people who never sinned. Wrong. Grew up that with the whole my life. Anyway, it's a common misconception. But I think it was quite funny when I started hanging out with Catholic chaplaincy at Sydney Uni. One of the leaders there said to me, I think I was introducing myself, and I was really self-conscious that there were so many Marys and Bernadettes and Theresas around. And I was like, hi, I'm Jovina. There's no Saint Jovina. I'm not named after anyone holy. And this leader said to me, well, hopefully one day there'll be a Saint Jovina. And I was like, oh, I don't think so. I don't know any other Jovinas. So I don't know how there could be a saint. Anyway, eventually it clicked, and I was being led into what is this terribly kept, well, this a secret that should not be a secret. That is the universal call to holiness. So how to live heroic virtue in the ordinary and the extraordinary, that is how we become saints. Now, here's the point where I'm meant to give you a solid example of saints. And there are 10,000, more than 10,000 to choose from. So it's kind of hard to pick one or two. So I'm just going to dominate the room tonight and pick the Martin family of Alençon at the end of the 19th century. You might know them better as St. Louis and Zélie, who were the first married couple to be canonized together by the church. And also happen to be known as the parents of St. Teresa of Lisieux. So what you may know and what may not know is that they actually both wanted to be religious in their early lives. My favourite ever story about St. Louis, because he was not a very effusive man, so he didn't write a lot of letters, but we do know that at the age of 22, he was living on the border of France and Germany in a town called Strasbourg, and he set off. He decided, this is it, I'm going to go and join a monastery. And so he kind of organised all his affairs and, you know, took all he could in his back, and he set off for the Grand Saint Bernard Monastery in the Swiss Alps, which was established by St. Bernard 9 centuries earlier. It's 8,000 feet above sea level. You can imagine what that walk would have been like. Google Maps tells me it would take about 3 days. I've got no idea how fast a walk he was, but it took some time. But you can imagine what a walk that would be like. It'd be like, yes, I'm going, I'm seizing the day, I'm embracing my vocation. Yes, Lord, all for you. And he was welcomed in by the prior. No, I don't think it was the prior. I think it was whoever was on door duty. Welcomed in and brought to the prior, and the prior talked to him that very afternoon and asked him a little bit about his childhood and, have you learnt Latin? And no, you haven't learned Latin. Okay, well, very nice to meet you, but not for you. And showed him the door, and back down the mountain, poor old St. Louis went. I love that story so much because St. Louis made a decision and he went through with it, and it wasn't for him. But that's okay, because he still ended up being a saint another way, and God still made him a saint. St. Zélie too, also interesting story. She asked the superior of the Sisters of St. Vincent de Paul for admission to the convent. And the superior just said to her, without much explanation at all, it is not the will of God. So both of them are rejected from this initial first desire, but they went on to meet each other many years later and get married and become saints. And I'm telling you these stories because it shows that family life can be the nursery for sanctity. That an ordinary lacemaker and an ordinary watchmaker could live ordinary lives with heroic virtue. Their lives show us that tragedy happens and God can work through it, and God does work through it. They had 9 children, but only 5 of them made it to adulthood. One of their surviving daughters had lots of issues, lots of behavioural issues, and just lots of tragic things happened to her in her life. To top it all off, St. Zélie died of breast cancer at 45 when her youngest child, Therese, was just 3. St. Louis suffered many strokes and what sounds to me like a vascular dementia, and ended up spending 3 years in a psychiatric ward towards the end of his life. This is not picture perfect. This is not a rosy, awesome picture of life. There was so much tragedy and suffering in their lives, and yet there was love and joy suffused throughout it. So their sacrifices joyfully given were given without counting the costs at all. Their life wasn't at all about avoiding suffering, but embracing whatever crosses came their way. And they've been raised up now as saints for us all to emulate. And this is what we see through all the lives of the saints. We see that these constant small sacrifices, these constant practices of dying to self, train us in this habit of heroic virtue, which leads to life to the full. Most of you, I'm sure, would know the story of Sir Maximilian Kolbe. You know, that ultimate sacrifice in Auschwitz where he exchanged his life for another and joyfully lived out his last 14 days in a starvation bunker. It's extraordinary. But I have no hesitation in guessing that the man could not have done that if he had not lived his whole life making these small sacrifices, these small acts of love to God, these small acts that built his heroic virtue. Well, you don't just start with that one final sacrifice. We build it up every day. So what beautiful missions the saints have had. And I'm sure there are some of you sitting here thinking, I want to be a saint. How do I get there? What do I do? I'd really love someone else to tell me the exact right way for me to reach my mission in life, whether it's my vocation or my career or whatever else, big decisions that you're trying to make. It'd be great if someone else could just come in and tell you exactly what God's will is. And I'm not that person. A, because I'm not a spiritual director, but B, also because I'm not that wise. But I do understand that stress. Particularly about vocation. I remember on Valentine's Day of 2010, I was in New York on a retreat with the Sisters of Life on Valentine's Day. And I remember just being so stressed about it all because I just really wanted to do the right thing, and I wanted to make sure that I did what God wanted me to do in finding my vocation. And I was talking to this sister, this really Bronxy kind of sister named Sister Loretta, and I was kind of like verbal diary. I was like, sister, I really feel like I'm called to marriage, but what if my heart is deceiving me, and what if I am so broken that I don't know how to hear God's call? Blah 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 blah. And she just said to me, Jovina, relax. Okay, God's given you this desire. You keep praying to him. You pray to St. Joseph and Our Lady every day. And in a year, God will tell you, God will show you exactly where your heart lies. No, honestly, I'm not doing her accent. Sorry about her accent, but she's much more Bronxy than that. And in the end, Valentine's Day the next year was the time that Gabriel sent me flowers to show me that he was interested in me. So I don't know about the timing of that, but Sister Loretta, she was onto it. She just directed me to St. Joseph and Our Lady. You know, it seems so basic, but it's important to be reminded of these things. In the end, I realized that the deepest desire of my heart was not something I had just made up, and that I could trust that deep desire that God had put there. But also that trusting God could close whatever door he wanted to in my life. And I think giving up that sense of control that I so craved and learning just to rely on God rather than my own efforts was actually a really fundamental factor for persistence in my own vocation, and what I've seen from many of my other friends who've entered different vocations and also marriage, that relying on God, that it's not all up to me to make this vocation work and to make my commitment to my vocation. That it's actually not through my own efforts, but through relying on God. So what can I tell you, now that we're talking about mission, not so much about avoiding suffering, what can I tell you about finding your mission and purpose in this life? And that is, it's a no-brainer, stay close to God. If you don't have a regular prayer life, I understand that, grow one. Ask for help. Pray for an openness of heart. If you don't have a spiritual director, find one. Ask God for one. He will do the rest. God is trustworthy, and he does not abandon his people. I think it's important to understand that God has made many promises to his people, but he hasn't promised that life will be easy. He hasn't promised that our faith is a safeguard against tragedy. It is not. And I tell you with some no small discomfort that at least 5 of the good Catholic weddings I've witnessed or been close to in the past 15 years have ended in separation and then annulment. I also tell you that a dear friend with a beautiful and strong faith developed psychosis and suicided 6 years ago. You know, being close to Jesus does not mean we're untouched by the sufferings of this life, but it does grant us a glimpse of the bigger picture that God has. And this is where I like to finish by talking about when our plans don't go as we planned, when our lives don't go as we planned. Let's think about the apostles, the early martyred Christians, and Our Lady. Do you think any of their lives turned out how they'd envisaged when they were just starting out? Look at any of the lives of the saints that you know. I doubt St. Gianna Beretta planned to leave 4 children without a mother, so young. And I'm sure the hopes and dreams of Blessed Pier Giorgio were not that his mountaineering and his work with the poor would be cut short at 24. Yet from where they stand now, God's plan was much, much better than any plans they had, I'm sure. Because God does have a bigger picture that we cannot see. There's this beautiful image that someone shared with me after my son died, and it was the image of a tapestry. So I don't know if you've ever been to an art museum where there's a huge tapestry, like huge, more than a story tall. And if you look at the wrong side of the tapestry as it hangs there, it's a mess. It's just disgusting to look at. It's just a bunch of fibers and there's no pattern and there's no meaning to it. But if you actually realize that you're looking at the wrong side and you look at the other side, it's beautiful. It's a work of art. There's layers of beauty and story and unfolding. And this image, this person told me this to show that we're on one side of the tapestry and we can only see just a little bit of the reality, but God sees all on the other side. And it's impossible for us to see that side where we are now. It's not that God's trying to keep it all to his, I don't think it is that. I think it's just that it's impossible for us to really understand the bigger picture. You read the book of Job and that's God's answer to Job, you know, like. But in my life, I see that his plans are so much better than mine. If you'd asked me 10 years ago, where will you be in 10 years? My plans wouldn't have included any of this. I would have said, move to Queensland, no, or, you know, all sorts of things. But probably would have also said, married to that guy, no. But I know that his plans are so much better than mine ever were. So much better, including all the tragic stuff that's happened. So how do we persist in the Christian life knowing that our hopes and dreams are probably not going to be exactly as we envisage? Well, we've got to keep making decisions. I think the worst thing is to be paralysed by indecision and paralysed by this thought that we might do the wrong thing by God. You know, I totally forgot to show the photo. Anyway, I'll leave Louis and Zelly there for the rest of the talk. So yes, we've got to keep making decisions. And sometimes our decisions don't work out how we'd hoped. Case in point, it doesn't matter. We know that God has a bigger picture and he's all powerful and and we've just got to keep moving forward in him. Make decisions is probably the 2 most important words I could say right now. Anyone who's scrolled through Netflix for 30 minutes trying to find the next thing that they want to watch and think, maybe there's something better out there, knows about the tyranny of choice. A very wise man at World Youth Day 2008 said, 1 mission is better than 1,000 options. I don't think he's ever scrolled Netflix, but he knows the truth. 1 mission is better than 1,000 options. And you know what else? You know what you notice when you read the lives of the saints? That it cost them, that life in Christ cost them dearly, and that they kept giving without ever counting that cost. Because all of this, sometimes if we just want to live a good life and live an easy life, a lot of what we're talking about here, heroic virtue, dying to self, it all just sounds a bit costly, doesn't it? In this world we live in, it's so hard to even acknowledge the truth and speak the truth, let alone live the truth and defend the truth and embrace our cross and be saints. It's all really costly. But you know what? Anything less than the cross isn't life to the full. It's a cheap counterfeit. It's a Diet Coke version of life. It's mediocre. And we just have to start on the journey to realize that it is mediocre and that what Christ offers, cross and all, is life to the full. And so I'm going to finish now with another quote from Archbishop Charles Chaput. Sorry, I just really like his quotes. And I'll leave you with this. Cheap faith, faith without a cost, is an act of self-delusion. It makes no disciples. It changes nothing about the world. And that's because no one is persuaded by a faith that's indistinguishable from a comfortable form of therapy. So this time of testing that we face today, this moment is not a moment of defeat. It's a moment of privilege. We are becoming awake again to the measure of God's love, the price he paid for our redemption, and the happiness, the real happiness, his sacrifice makes possible for those who truly believe. And that's all I have for tonight. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Jovina. We'd like for the really wonderful and meaningful talk about the important topic about the notion of suffering. I think is one that a lot of us can relate to and we can learn towards. So thank you for sharing your experiences.
Thank you.